Hello. This was in the newspaper this morning, 14th November, and it says, civil servant, citizen and politician lost each other already for a long time. I focused on that in episodes 10 and 11, and in this episode, number 12, I'm going to focus on knowledge. This is the article. It describes 5 important lessons. These lessons are: it is too complicated for some citizens, automation has gone too far, mistrust reigns at government, there's too little influence from practitioners, and the House of Parliament does not make things easier. Many aspects from the previous episodes come into play in these 5 lessons. Today we will see that they arise to a large extent from the way in which we deal with knowledge. It's important to realize that knowledge differs from information. Knowledge is human bound, human dead, knowledge gone. Information can also be put in a book or in a data file, so it's easier to transfer. In knowledge, we make a distinction between explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge. Here you see the so-called knowledge iceberg. We know that 11% of an iceberg is above seawater level. And that's the same with knowledge. Only a relatively small part of the knowledge is visible. We call it explicit knowledge. You can translate this into information. And that is not possible with the so-called implicit knowledge. It's difficult to put it into word. We also call it tacit knowledge. For example, how do you keep balanced on your bike and how do you hit the nail straight into a wall? You can only explain this in a limited way in a book. The more experience you gain, the more you will rely on implicit knowledge. The brothers Dreyfus showed that we can distinguish between 5 phases in a learning process. They are novice, advanced beginner, competence, proficient, and expert. The novice needs rules. For example, if you're learning to drive, you need to know what the first gear is and what the second. The advanced beginner is able to apply the rules in different contexts. The competent person needs fewer and fewer rules and is able to develop several alternatives and weigh them against each other. A proficient can make an implicit distinction between main issues and side issues. What matters he puts on the foreground, the other he pushes into the background. When circumstances change, he is able to switch foreground and background without any delay. The expert also acts on base of intuition. For example, he already brakes before the child suddenly crosses the street. In this picture, you can see the relationship between implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. The beginner mainly functions on basis of explicit knowledge, following rules, and the expert performs activities mainly based on implicit knowledge, tacit knowledge. The experience increases. We know now that it's mainly implicit knowledge that allows us to adapt, to navigate through a complex survival landscape. So if we take complexity seriously, we also must take implicit knowledge seriously. However, we don't. And that is because implicit knowledge is elusive and often jumbled. Especially governments like to control and monitor processes, so knowledge has to be made explicit, measurable. We see that reflected in the 5 lessons I showed you at the beginning of this episode. We rush into complicatedness. The automation functions on basis of explicit rules. The urge to control processes is driven by mistrust. The people with a lot of tacit knowledge are not heard. And if something doesn't go the way we want, we make new rules. The result is that we organize our society in such a way that it functions on basis of competence management. The proficient and expert phases are not sufficiently valued. Real experts are seen by many as grey and not fitting into modern organizations, especially when they work on basis of intuition. You can roughly distinguish between three types of rules. Assistance rules, which beginners need to enter a field. Boundary rules, which can be applied if individuals or organizations act undecidedly. And agreements, derived in dialogue by parties. It goes wrong when rules for beginners are imposed on experts. You then ignore the value of tacit knowledge. It goes also wrong when you restrict people who make a positive effort with rules that are derived for people and organizations that tend towards evil. And it goes wrong when agreements are not kept. As a conclusion, to be able to cope with complexity, it's not so much about fewer rules, it's about dealing with the existing rules in a dignified manner. This requires understanding and appreciation of implicit knowledge, tacit knowledge. How can we transfer tacit knowledge? By telling stories. And that's what we'll discuss in more detail in the next episode. I hope to see you again. Till then, hoi!